Welcome back to the Media Roundtable Industry Edition. If you have been following us at all, we've been spending the last few years talking to leading voices in podcasts about what they create, why they create it, and the impact they want to have on the world. This is a true roundtable format. And like we say in our name, this is an industry edition. So we're going to talk about things that are important in media. Usually we come at it through the prism of audio, but it's interesting. Audio is starting to permeate everything. So even looking at it through the lens of audio, there's a lot of interesting national topics that we're going to be discussing. We have an all-star cast for you today. I am your host, Dan Granger, founder and CEO of Oxford Road, but I am joined by fellow agents of influence. Let me just tell you who we have today. We have Kristen Duenas, who is our associate media director. Welcome, Kristen.
Hi, thanks for having me back.
We have Neal Lucey, our EVP of strategy and product at Oxford Road, our resident extrovert. Welcome, Neal.
Thank you. It's great to be here, Dan.
We have the one and only Stephen Abraham, president at Oxford Road.
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. I'm delighted to be here. First time for me, so be gentle.
We'll see what happens. And you know who we don't have is Giles Martin. He still refuses to come on the program, but we'll all in due time. So guys, there's a lot going on that we need to unpack here, and some of our heavier hitting stories, I'll say it, I think we're going to spend most of our time on. We have Elon Musk taking over Twitter. We have Kanye on the Lex Fridman podcast, or Yay. We have TikTok moving into podcast. We have money through gaming. We have podcasts now taking over the top spot in media consumption for talk radio. So we have some really important and interesting subjects that we're going to cover today. One thing I want to do before we start the first topic, which is going to be Twitter, is I just want to reread something we usually share at the end of the show, but that is our mission, because I think that some of the stuff going on in the news right now falls right like center of the bullseye involving our mission at this show and why we got into it. I think there's massive implications. So our mission is that we are dedicated to mobilizing marketers to advance truth and civility in journalism. We want you to not just know the news, but use it for good. So that's what we're trying to do here. So let's see how that plays out. We're going to start with our top story. Elon Musk comes in and buys Twitter for about $44 billion, a little bit of walking around money. And there are a ton of implications for brand safety, for civility and polarization in America. There's implication for brands. There's implications for audio. But let me just recap a few of the things that are going on, and then we'll start getting some perspectives on this. So the deal, as it's closing, Elon walks into the Twitter headquarters and basically makes a dad joke, carrying a huge sink with him. Not unsurprising. True to form for him. Then he issues a statement trying to appease advertisers. I'm going to run through a few of those quotes. The deal closes. He immediately executes the CEO and executives at Twitter. Not terribly unsurprising. Crowns himself CEO, or Chief Twit. And also makes an announcement that they haven't made any changes in their content policy, but forecasts that there will be a content council. It'll just be different than the one that exists today. Now, let me just tell you a few of the things that he said in his message to advertisers. One, that he bought the platform, in his words, to quote unquote help humanity, and that he doesn't want it to be, as you've probably heard, a free-for-all hellscape. You might argue that that's what it has been. He says that he did it because it's important to civilization to have a common digital town square where a wide range of beliefs can be debated in a healthy manner without resorting to violence. And he says there is currently great danger that social media will splinter into far right and far left wing echo chambers that generate more hate and divide our society. Maybe you've heard about that somewhere before. He's also going to be putting a real premium on paid subscriptions, and he says that Twitter should be warm and welcoming to all. So this is speaking to the themes that we have been talking about since day one on this show. It's very, very interesting. And the rhetoric that we're getting from his desk at this point seems to align with the values we've been putting forth. The challenge, of course, is that, we saw when Donald Trump won the election in 2016, we saw him step onto a stage and make a bunch of statements about how unifying he intended to be and how it was time to put differences aside and move the country forward. That didn't exactly happen. We played on this show for you last year Biden's inaugural address, where he talked about similar themes, about unifying, about lowering the temperature. I'm not sure that's happened either. So I think we've been getting conditioned a little bit to hear happy talk at the beginning of a new initiative about how this is going to be an opportunity for us to come together and unite. And then the rubber meets the road and things go in a very different direction. So first question to the group is, what are the implications for brands? What would you be thinking about if you're an advertiser here today?
If I'm an advertiser today, I think first and foremost, I'm waiting and seeing what's going to, happen with Twitter. Because it's an unknown territory. I think that Elon Musk kind of getting rid of the echo chamber and having that forum for public discourse is admirable, but it just remains to be seen like what will actually happen. So I think I'm a little bit cautious if I'm advising brands on how much I'm going to advertise on Twitter right now.
And I see Kristen winding up to share some thinking here. What do you got?
I do. When it comes to the remaining to be seen, I think we saw it over the weekend where multiple outlets are stating, via statistical research, that the use of the N-word overnight has risen 500%, largely because the internet trolls have wanted to see what is Musk actually going to do now that he owns the platform. What kind of censorship is there going to be in place? And they're putting their feelers out there. They're testing that now. 500% is a great increase on the use of the N-word and the see you next Tuesday. So, it's going to be, I think, as they keep doing this, nothing's going to happen to them. And they're going to broaden what they're going to try and get away with, which is a huge risk for advertisers in this space. Normally our message is wait and see, don't be reactionary. But if it were me and these were my dollars and over the weekend within, 48 hours, this is happening, I'm pulling back and using that as my wait and see.
It's an interesting one. I tend to agree with in equal parts, both Kristen and Neal. I think it is a moment to set the pause to see what happens. We know how polarizing this individual can be. But if I just look at one proxy, which is Dogecoin, and see that that's actually gone up 105% in the last 48 hours, which is an indicator of people's intent to get behind somebody like Musk, I think it's going to be an interesting time, not only over the next couple of months as he begins to divulge what he wants to do with the platform, but probably in the next 6 or 7 days, we're going to know and we're going to get a sense. I think, to Kristen's point, yes, there has been 500% increase in certain words that we all find extremely uncomfortable and that are profanity. I'm hoping with his plans to help, democratize and hopefully put some rules in place on Twitter, we may actually see that eradicated in a quicker time than they've actually seen the spike. But at the moment, I am almost of the mindset to say, let's just wait and see. And that's not going to be a long time. It's probably going to be in the next 48 hours.
So I think there's some good points being brought up here. For me, I would agree with the advice to brands. If you are concerned about what type of environment your brand is exposed to, I would definitely not jump in at this moment. That being said, whatever you might think about Musk, I will say he's had some success innovating. He's had some success building value. And I would put I would wager that he is going to make Twitter a more successful business. And I think to do that, he's going to have to find a way to take away some of these fears and concerns that advertisers have. And of course, he's going to rely very, very heavily on subscription. It looks like he's already taking their blue product certification, and sounds like he's taking the price of that from like $3 or $4 to like 20 as, first act as head of the company. And so I think that's a nod to the fact that there's going to be a strategy for him to get a return on his investment. I hope that some of the innovation he's been able to bring to other fields does play out here. And I honestly, I am rooting for this company because I think it does represent an opportunity for us to start again with a platform, hit reset, and say, how can we allow for different voices to have a forum with consistent standards that you don't get to say anything you want, but we do have a new start on welcoming divergent views, because I totally agree with him. And we've talked about it on this show. If we don't find a way to make room for at least non-violent, non-extremist voices within social media, we're going to end up with blue platforms and red platforms. And even you can kick Kanye off of any platform you want. Somehow everybody's still talking about it. It doesn't stop. People are no longer talking about Donald Trump because he got removed from Twitter. So making people go away may not be the solution. If there's a commercially viable one that actually protects brands and allows managed conversation to happen in a public forum, I think that could be a really good thing. So I'm hopeful, but again, we'll wait and see. Neal, did you have another thought you want to chime in with?
Yeah, I have a couple of things. One, I always think in advertising and media that once something is free, it's hard to charge a subscription for it. So while I think it's the right move to try to, come up with a premium option for Twitter, I just don't know how successful that would be with the amount of alternatives that are out there. So charge me for something, I'll go to TikTok, I'll go to Snap, I'll go somewhere else, I'll go to Reddit.
Do you believe that for the general consumer, or do you think about that in terms of the opportunity for businesses like ours who have a budding podcast or a channel where they're trying to reach people? Do you think the B2B play is not going to be successful?
I think of it from the consumer perspective more than anything. The other point I'd like to make is I totally agree with you that I hope he is successful. My caution is, he talks about the echo chamber. Part of the echo chamber is due to us, right? We go on to Facebook, we go on to Twitter, we follow the people that we like, that we know. So we're somewhat the cause of our own echo chamber. And then the algorithms start to serve us kind of that type of information. So it's like, it starts with us, and then I think it's amplified by, algorithms that are out there. So I do hope that there's an open discussion. I think in practice, it will be very difficult because there will be moderation, because there's so much disinformation. There's so much misinformation out there. There's outside entities trying to attack the US with misinformation that, while it's very admirable, in practice, it may be difficult to execute as well as he'd like.
No doubt. And I think to your point earlier about subscriptions, and this has been a recurring topic on the show, is like, as we're seeing a correction in the marketplace, a year ago, 2 years ago, everybody thought, oh, our podcasts, I was having reporters ask, do you think podcasts are all going to be subscription in the future? And, what we've learned is there's a limit to how many subscriptions you're willing to tolerate as a consumer. At some point, you have to draw a line. And as gas prices go up and interest rates go up, the value of things changes. I agree that it's going to be a tougher sell for consumers. There's always going to be a premium layer. But in terms of businesses, I look at this on behalf of Oxford Road, and I think about our efforts, and I'm like, I would love it if somebody would clean that place up and provide a path for us. And, for those that are just early in their relationship with the Media Roundtable and the content we put out, our belief is that nutrition labels can be a way to allow consumers and brands to preset what type of content they're willing to be exposed in and associated with. And I think that's never been more true than a platform like Twitter, although that's probably going to require some deep tech. And, you know, we are in communication with some people that are working on the new plan that they have over there. And I hope that we're able to suggest a few key partners that I think can help with the governance issue.
I think one of the bigger questions is going to be more about how much he can keep his own ego in check.
Sure.
I have no question that he is going to be able to bring some of the smartest people on the face of the planet to actually fix the problems that Twitter has. I think that on the face of it, we know he's polarizing, not quite in, say, a way that some politicians are polarizing, but, you know, he does have a fan base, he has his detractors. So I think it's going to just be interesting when you think about the two elements: world's richest man, single most famous or infamous microblogging site, the two together, it does give some degree of cause of concern. So I'm interested to see what happens over the next 6 or 7 days rather than the next 6 or 7 months. With regards to the subscription piece, I think he should put a pause on that as well, because I think, yes, some consumers are going to say, well, look, you know, do I start to pay for this service when I've had it for free for now? I think it's going to be more challenging for the actual content providers on there who have hundreds of thousands, if not millions of followers. Is that going to suddenly mean they have to shift off the platform if all those people move away? And he doesn't want that. So I think it's going to be an interesting growth as he figures out his own plan.
Well, you bring up such an interesting point, because his other companies have become so important and are so tied in with so many different governments and economies. He's, you know, with China and the Middle East, with our government.
Sure.
You know, SpaceX is not a small concern, nor is Starlink, nor is Tesla. And
Sure.
how do you satisfy all of these people at the same time? I wonder if he might actually be able to not have to worry about it, because he's so entangled with so many different players. There's no way to keep everybody happy. So I don't know how you do it, but somebody's doing the math on this that probably has better insight than I do. But it certainly is interesting to imagine, how is he going to balance his own personal entanglements in managing these other companies while he's trying to also manage a profitable public square. Yeah. Neal, you got more?
Yeah, I do have more. I think that what I've been thinking about a lot lately is, you know, you, like, for advertisers, a lot of the, like, in the past, the brand safety was provided by the platform that you're advertising on. So I think about television, I think about terrestrial radio, sort of the traditional media. So you could rely on those traditional media to be relatively brand safe. You'd have brand guidelines. I think the balance of responsibility is now shifting to the advertisers, where they have to choose where they're going to put their money and support responsible content. So I think it used to be a little bit more kind of the media had that control, and you felt pretty good about the media choices you're making and you'd be safe. Now I think the emphasis is more on the advertisers really doing their due diligence to figure out where they want to advertise and who they want to support, like what platforms they want to support.
Well, it's such a critical theme that we've been taking on with this program, because as we've seen with Edelman's Trust Barometer, when you look at the major institutions in this country, trust in government is in the basement. Trust in media is in the basement. The only institution where trust remains is actually the private sector. And with the shift from shareholder capitalism to stakeholder capitalism, we have had a wave in the last few years during a growing economy where everybody says we need to serve the interests of more people in the community, not just line our own pockets as our only objective. They're getting put to the test right now. And, you know, media is business and tech is business, and tech is having a bit of a backlash. So this is a very critical time. And I totally agree with you because this is an opportunity to start to restore trust in some of our institutions. And the stakes are high. I don't know what happens after there are no institutions left that people trust. So important stuff. And I like I said,
They'll
I
be able
think
to
that
come to Oxford Road.
yeah, exactly. Fair enough. Okay. Let's move on from this topic, and I'm sure it will continue to unfold. And at some point, we'll talk about the audio implications. There was an incident that came pretty close to home. You know, when we got into this business, it was like the tech guy, Leo Laporte, and This Week in Technology, and you had a comedy show called Keith and the Girl. You didn't see A-list household names coming onto podcasts or musicians stirring up controversy in our little domain that we've worked in for so long. But this last week, we saw something significant happen. So, Stephen, do you mind giving us a quick recap of what occurred?
No, sure. And firstly, I really like your segue from Twitter where you mentioned the Twit report. So it's quite good, especially
there you go.
My last point about Elon is the fact that he's now called himself Chief Twit. But, you know, obviously, I think he gets the in-joke there. Yeah, so just to summarize briefly, obviously, there has been a lot of furor over the comments that Kanye has made in the press, the anti-Semitic comments, I guess, a series of incidents that have happened with him over the past few months, which has culminated in him becoming a highly talked about and polarizing character, also one that has caused a lot of offense to a lot of people. As a consequence, you know, he has been banned off a lot of social media, Twitter actually being one of them, and so is seeking other outlets and platforms to voice his perspectives. Talk radio has been one, and also he is now appearing on some podcasts, and obviously this week was a guest to continue his discussion with Lex Friedman, and there was quite a series of backlash, but also some positive aspects that came out of that. So I think, does that summarize what you're looking for, Dan?
Yeah, I think it does. And I think the question for the group is, what's a brand to do when you're sponsoring what is still can be considered user-generated content, but you buy a program that ostensibly is about science, engineering, technology, and all of a sudden in walks Kanye, and all of a sudden brands start feeling like Taylor Swift getting an award, right? Like, what? How did we get here? So what does this mean for our industry? And is there a takeaway for brands?
There is a takeaway from brands, and I think brands have already been asking a lot of the podcast industry, and we as an agency are obviously reacting to that in terms of understanding the best places that they can appear to be brand safe. There's been a lot of discourse about how we can start to get to a point where environments and content are considered more safe, but at the same time we don't want to suppress conversation. So I think it's a learning not just for brands, but how we as consultants and agencies of brands can best start to work better with those outlets that we're dealing with, and where we're trying to make brands more famous, which is, what is the best process and the best sort of method to move forward to make sure brands feel comfortable about appearing in there, but we don't suppress the editorial part of the environments that we're appearing, suppress those conversations. And I think, yes, there's some degree of process and protocol that you can get in place, but there's always going to be a degree of church and state between the editorial teams and the advertising teams. It's understanding when a case in point becomes so critical that it is a right to approach the advertisers, to at least give them the heads up, as I think in the pre-discussion around this show, Dan, you eloquently said, which is, nobody really likes to have a surprise. Of course, we want to be in environments that are topical and where the conversations could take place, but there has to be a better understanding of what that potential outcome or the fallout could be to make sure advertisers don't get bitten in advance. So there's got to be about a degree of common sense that has to be layered in.
Right. And so you've got a show that gets a guest, that the show isn't controversial, but the guest is highly controversial, and brands are caught in the middle. Kristen, what's your perspective on this?
You know, the way I see it is, in this particular instance, the show was so excited to have Kanye West, and I think they knew it was going to be a spectacle. And in their excitement, they forgot that, the reason why their show exists is because of the advertisers paying to be there and keeping the lights on. And I think going forward, this is going to be an incredibly valuable learning lesson, is be excited about the guest that comes on, especially when it's going to be a controversy and everyone's going to be talking about it. What greater advertising for the show itself than what took place? But they need to be conscientious about the brands that are on there and their threshold for what's going to happen and the fallout that takes place as well. So I think going forward, this show and other shows like it are going to have to be strategic. And yes, you've got the show, you want to put it out, but take a second to consider who else is going to be there, who it's going to affect, and give them the opportunity to make a decision and not just get dragged into something that they were unprepared for.
So do you guys feel like the problem was that they didn't give the advertisers a heads up, or is the problem that they allowed Yay on the platform, or is it both? What do you guys think?
For myself, I don't think there's a problem with having Yay on the platform. I think Kanye, he's gonna say Kanye things, right? We know this. If you start saying nobody can have a platform to speak, then you start running into First Amendment issues, and nobody wants that, right? Let's keep it constitutional, shall we? But at the same time, yes, have him on, have him speak. He's going to say his things. There's no such thing as bad publicity. There's that whole saying, and it's true, because it doesn't matter. At the end of the day, he's driven so much chatter around himself. It's free publicity. But they need to be conscientious. They need to have that conversation with the advertisers. They cannot just take for granted the people that are keeping that show running. And that's what's taking place.
I think there is such a thing as bad publicity. I think the answer to your question from my perspective, Dan, is both. To Kristen's point, yes, of course, there's an environment where he needs to be on. But I think there are going to be instances where, when you have an individual who's come on who is so polarizing, and where brands can be the ones that have the fallout, it is the moral duty of the environment to at least alert them, and then they have a possibility to make a choice. We saw with some of the brands that appeared, the fallout where it didn't even mention the host who was actually hosting the show, or even talk about the show. It just referenced it, and some of the brands were actually the ones who got labeled with sponsoring this environment. That was not their intent. So I think that there's a degree of there has to be an application of common sense. No one's saying it has to not have that conversation, but at least bring them in as part of the conversation, seeing as how they are a critical part of why the show exists in the first place. So I think I do agree with Kristen. I think there was a degree of thoughtlessness. They got swept up in the furor and the excitement of having this very extreme but very, very sort of polarizing and zeitgeist topping individual in the moment. But they need to take a step back and understand what the context is and what the actions are going to be, or the repercussions of the event itself.
Yeah, I'm thinking that I don't have any issue, especially after listening to the podcast of Lex Fridman giving Kanye that platform. So that, I think that's like and we're kind of conditioned to look at the headline, right? Where we don't really dig deeper into actually the content. He did an excellent job with the interview, I thought, and he did not let Kanye off the hook one bit. So from the podcast itself, I don't think, yes, he gave Kanye a platform, but I think he did it in his own self-interest to actually call him out on some of the things he's saying, right? Yeah. And so I think there is a lot of value in that, and hearing that discourse and not letting Kanye off the hook one bit.
We are absolutely aligned on that, but given the fact we're in the interest of making brands more famous, not infamous, the situation arose whereby the brands that were involved did have fallout. I think Lex could have taken a step further and just had his editorial team cross-reference it. That's where I think the issue is.
Yeah, and I don't disagree with that either. I think that I think in the past with podcasts, you could pretty much, the podcast, they had content, they lived in a certain area, and you could choose what was like appropriate or safe for your brand by just the nature of your podcast.
Life was so simple then.
Yeah, I think a lesson to us as an agency and to advertisers is that you do need to inform the podcast that you're working with in terms of what's appropriate for your advertising appear, opposite and what is not. That doesn't let the podcast off the hook for informing the advertisers or the sponsor what was going to be in the podcast itself. But I think that there's now another layer of kind of establishing these guidelines with our podcast partners to make sure that they don't appear in content that they don't want to be next to. And then the last thing I would say is there will be, I'm sure that podcast reach a lot of people. So there will be advertisers who would love to take advantage of that, right? So some advertisers will want to be, I don't want to be anywhere close to that, but this is a huge audience opportunity for other advertisers. So it's like you have to look at it from
like
both.
Parler. Listen, totally agree with you. I mean, look, so much of this comes down to the attention economy and the problems with it, right? The reason that Kanye has been able to reach so much success in part is because people keep spelling his name right. He does something outrageous and it just gets him that much more attention. And it causes people like us to now be continuing to perpetuate his brand, good, bad, or otherwise. I think
there needs to be also take a step back, and we are dealing with, at least based on what they would inform us in the broader press, somebody who's having a meltdown.
For sure.
Discussion needs to be there.
Yeah. Well, and some people would make the argument, don't give them a platform. Do not give this person who has proven to make irrational statements in public. Don't give them that audience. Why, if he had his own show and was talking like this, there's a very good chance that people would start removing him. If he was on YouTube, they'd probably be taking it down at this point. That being said, I think I'm with Neal in that it was a good conversation because somebody was bringing accountability to him. And the reason I am such a big fan of podcasts and have very little use for Twitter, one is because I'm so freaking long-winded, but the other reason is because you can actually unpack a thought and have a meaningful dialogue and have time to actually check somebody. But what was really interesting, if you watch the way that Lex Fridman did it, he did it in love. He was loving and he was corrective and he spoke truth in a way that you don't get to hear or read or see when you're clicking the BuzzFeed link or the clickbait, right? And so that's what's beautiful about podcasts. But I think we're all in unanimous agreement that while it's good that there's a place to have thoughtful discussions and unpack meaning in ways that you can't do with the attention economy, it's also something where brands do need to be protected. And the truth is, we've been on this brand safety and suitability train for a while now. And I would say we are far further ahead than anybody in the marketplace in terms of bringing forth solutions, creating solutions, advancing solutions. And yet nobody has a lock on how to deal with who your guest is going to be. It's one thing to say, how do we measure a show so that we know that a brand is generally going to be safe there? It's another thing to say, how do we measure hosts so that if they have controversy off the air when they're not recording their show, how do we solve for that? Like, we're getting closer on these things, but we haven't gotten to the point where we know how to deal with this episodically. And I think as a result, we're going to be instituting some very manual protocols to do this, but the industry is a few years away from having this thing licked. So I would say, be patient, take care, and remember, like we say this in our playbooks that we give to brands, like, if you think that there's going to be a brand safe podcast, it doesn't exist. There is nowhere that is 100% brand safe. We just do the best that we can, and we try to take the lessons as they come. So, wonderful discussion. Hope we get to have more of it about the solutions that are coming forth or that we're bringing forth. But definitely, it's a reason why the topics we're covering on this show and some of the solutions that we're proposing in the market, such as Barometer, are so important for brands. Now, we've covered the big two, which gives us about 6 or 7 minutes to cover the next three. But I think there's some fun ones here. So first thing is that gaming appears to be recession proof. And Kristen's going to tell us a little bit about that.
Fun fact, Microsoft executive says that gaming is somewhat, in quotations, resilient to economic weakness. I believe it. So during economic downturns, we know that people tend to stay home more. They don't have to spend their dollars outside of the house. A video game console or a game on your phone, that's there to stay. And as long as it's not a subscription model like a World of Warcraft or Final Fantasy, then you've got this thing that you pay for the one time and you get to play it in perpetuity, right? So yes, gaming is resilient to an extent to economic weakness. Now, where it comes into what we're doing is now gaming is not related, limited to consoles. Gaming is on your phone, and we know that more and more mobile gaming advertising is doing really well for performance marketing.
I heard it's a great way to promote your podcast.
That too, that too. So if gaming holds up in recessions, and then performance advertisers have traditionally done really well throughout recessions, just due to the dollars being forced to work, it stands to reason, right, that then mobile gaming, great place for performance advertisers to be during these economic downturns.
I would say not just performance advertisers, right?
Oh, well, everyone, but my life is performance, so that's who I like.
Amen.
But consumers don't discern between the two when they see a brand. There are some ads that make them choose to make a behavioral decision that is going to trigger an immediate performance, immediate response. Then others are just going to be about the environment. I think it comes down to the environment that you're appearing in. It's going to depend on the game. It's going to depend on the audience as everything. Recession free, yeah, I would tend to agree. I think you could probably widen that to saying all entertainment, other than going to the theater, which is cost prohibitive. But media and streaming, when there's a recession, and let's be very direct here, the last 3 years, there's been a cultural recession in the fact that we all had to stay at home, right? So what saw a massive resurgence? Gaming, because it grouped people together. It's about where the ads appear. So is it going to disrupt or is it going to interrupt? It's all sort of, you have to apply the usual logic of media planning. I would say that there is going to be some pushback in the same way that, gamers pushed back very heavily when the loot boxes were all started to be pushed through games, and where it was just seen by the publishers to make a quick buck. Where advertisers can appear in the game, where it makes a genuine sort of integration that is, native in its environment and sits within the campaign of a gamer's experience in the right way, then I'm all for it. If it just seems overt and sees out of context, then it's not going to work. So you can apply the same rules as to any platform you're working in.
Stephen, let me ask you a question on this, because you've worked at agencies, you've worked for entertainment brands for many years, and we all know that the rule is that entertainment does better in a recession. People keep going to the movies because it's a cheap way to escape, right? But as you just said, theaters are struggling, and the rules are sort of changing on us in real time, because the first thing to get hit was these streaming services. And so is it possible that gaming maybe is a potential safe haven for growth? Now that some of the fundamentals that we've relied on in previous downturns aren't exactly doing, what they used to do?
I mean, perhaps, but just take into consideration outside of casual gamers, which, tends to be a more older and sort of female audience, actually, when you're talking about hardcore gamers, you're dealing with a group of people who are extremely opinionated. And if you appear in the wrong way, they will make their voice known. So you have to be very, very careful. If you're talking about general entertainment in film and television, yes, the streaming companies got hit, but let's not also forget that during COVID, they saw massive subscription increases because people couldn't go out. So their only form of entertainment was watching additional content through streaming services. Gaming obviously had a huge hit. Teenagers were really only being able to communicate with their friends through the environments of obviously social media, but also gaming, where they could still be communal. So I've probably forgotten the question, but I think it just needs to be sort of reined in again back to pure sort of media understanding and how people are in the right need state to consume that content.
So let's give Neal the final word here. Neal, gaming Is this a channel that brands and performance marketers should be paying extra attention to right now, or not?
It's a platform that we should be paying attention to because of the adoption of gaming from both a brand and performance perspective. I do agree with Steve that it doesn't work for everybody. And so just because the audience is there doesn't mean it's right for your brand. So I would say proceed with some caution to make sure that the brand fits, that it's in the right context in the environment, and it makes sense and is considerate of how the audience consumes the platform.
Neal, while we have you chatting, we're going to move to the fourth story, unless Stephen,
I was just going to say, as a case in point, and so sorry, I know we're almost out of time, but Monster appearing in Call of Duty makes sense, right? You would expect that brand, but not everybody is going to be right in Call of Duty.
That's right. I'm not going to go into the rabbit hole on that, though. Neal, you found some audio statistics. What is changing in our world right now based on this report?
Oh, there's a lot changing in our world, Dan. This is a public service announcement. We are an audio agency. It is incumbent on us to really stay up with the trends and what is coming out. So an interesting piece came out from NPR in conjunction with Edison Research called the Spoken Word Report. Spoken word, because there's really two aspects of audio, right? There's music, and then there's talk, news, information. So this is talking about the latter part of audio. It's interesting just to see how the trends have changed over time. So podcasts are up, I think, in total like 48% in terms of the content that's spoken word, like talk and personality. For the Gen Z audience, it's something up like 214%. And now podcasts are the preferred platform by just a hair over terrestrial for personalities. So
do you have any idea how that compares to streaming?
There wasn't a lot of discussion in streaming. I think streaming is still very much driven by music. Unless you're considering streaming, like you listening to your podcast through a streaming platform.
Well, I look at this story and I marvel, because I remember working in talk radio in 2005, 2006, telling people that this podcast thing I really thought was going to be something. And then people were like,
you saw the future.
What are you talking about?
Did you engineer COVID to spike this, Dan?
I'm not confirming, I'm not denying, but no, the industry wasn't ready for it, but it was like, it wasn't a hard call to make at the time, because audio is always like a decade behind every other channel. So all you have to do in audio, dirty little secret to predict the future in our business, is look at what the other industries in advertising are doing digitally, and then imagine we'll be there in about 5 to 10 years. And that's really what happened when the blogosphere kind of exploded. We saw the same need, but it's the fact that it has now taken over talk radio is extraordinary. And I think very meaningful for brands. It's taken a long time for the scales to tip. And I think part of the part that is also worth paying attention to is streaming's impact, because in a sense, what podcast did is it took over for on-demand content, where you would do appointment listening, or you might get a record or a CD of spoken word. There were different ways to get spoken word on demand before podcasts were available, but this has taken so much share, whereas streaming is a very analogous to what we saw on terrestrial radio. It's the new version of terrestrial radio. Podcast is the on-demand version. So I'm really interested to see if it's created a new market truly, or if it just erodes on the total pie that used to be, just radio. But I guess we'll have to see on that. Kristen, from your view, working on planning and buying, are there any surprises here? Does this change anything for you or for us?
I don't think so. I think, the last several years, we've seen this shift in real time, and this research is just verifying what we already knew.
Yeah, the podcast is actually a thing, huh?
Podcast is definitely a thing. Everybody's got a podcast. Heck, I had one for half a second.
You still do, Kristen, and you're here on it right now. This is your podcast as much as it is mine or Neal's or Shayla's, for that matter, who nobody can hear. So Stephen, you got a hot take on this one, because we got to move to the next story.
Yeah, just the final point is that, traditionally talk radio and radio has been leaned back, right? Other than the points where if you're one of those individuals who actually wants to phone in into late night talk radio, but podcast is lean in. It's the conscious decision to actually spend some time with an individual that you've gotten to know and that you are passionate about. And I think they're two very, very different need states. And I think it's a beautiful thing that radio.
Well, okay, all right. Now I have to engage. So as somebody that was a salesperson for the spoken word radio for 10 years, the whole pitch is that it's lean in versus FM, which is lean back. But what I will say, where I agree with you, is I actually think AM talk radio or talk radio formats are actually in the middle, and podcast is still way ahead. Because you actually put it inside of you. It is the only thing that you're going to do. The salience is through the roof, and that's why we see from performance doesn't lie. It's the truth serum. And when we see rates, you can charge CPMs on podcast that would never fly on talk radio, simply because the engagement is that much further. But it is lean in relative to
I guess
format.
lean in the sense that you've taken an actual decision to download something onto your smart device and you're going to listen to it at your leisure. Whereas you switch on and if there's a healthy debate, then you lean in. Here you're actually choosing. Is
there any type of advertising that's higher intent? I don't know if there is.
It's as close to word as mouth as I can actually see.
Okay, and in short form fashion, I'm just going to ask everybody for a hot take on this one. Sounds like TikTok is now entering the fray with podcast, and we don't know exactly what this is going to look like, but we do know they have over 1 billion users and over 138 million in the US. We've talked about some of the privacy concerns with TikTok in the past. I guess the question for the group is, what does this mean for the industry? What does it mean for brands?
Video is more important than ever, right? So, I think that TikTok sees what YouTube is doing, and YouTube is, by depending on what measure you look at, is either 1 or 2 as a platform of highest intent for podcasts next to Spotify. So it's either Spotify or YouTube. I think TikTok sees that and sees that this is a huge opportunity as a video platform.
I don't disagree with Neal. I think that combining the video with, the traditional podcast, methodology makes a certain amount of sense. Everybody wants in. This is TikTok's way of getting into that space. We don't know yet what it looks like. I think is the biggest question mark. What lengths are we talking about? How much content are you actually going to be getting in on a TikTok? Because TikToks are traditionally short form video. So what, the attention span here would stand to reason it's going to be as short as it is now, maybe. We're not sure. So, how do any advertisers fit into that, and how do you make that work? And I think there's just so many question marks now on how they're going to go about this that I don't think we can make any educated statements on it at this point.
I 100% agree. I'm assuming, Dan, you were then going to ask me, but I've jumped in because I think this is a
no, you were coming up.
Absolutely. I absolutely agree with Kristen. The part that excites me is, we traditionally know that, the type of audiences we can reach through podcast are of a certain age and demographic and social status. The listeners or the viewers, the individuals who partake in TikTok, i.e. my 16-year-old son, if I can actually reach him in some way, shape or form with a mini cast, as maybe they're going to call it, through that medium, and help educate him and have him listen more rather than just look at something that's going to have an attention span of whatever it is, a goldfish, 12 seconds is appealing to me, if we can get the right brands into the space.
So I'm going to take the view that, I'm going to agree with the view that we don't know anything yet. Right. So we definitely don't know if this is like when Facebook was coming on to was going to make a big splash in the podcast, or when everybody decided they were going to be Clubhouse. Nobody knows anything is like rule number one. Number two, for me, I don't like it because I don't want to give more information and influence to the Chinese government. That to me is a big concern that we do need to talk about more openly, and we need to talk about it more openly with more brands. It's not to be swept under the rug. That's one thought. My other thought is I'm kind of nervous as audio goes short form. I do think audio needs more short form capabilities, but TikTok is just so sensational that I worry that the wrong clips are going to be highlighted if that's what they're doing with it. So I'm a little nervous, but I also would say, who knows, this policy could change. They could drop it in 6 weeks. Let's see what happens after the midterms into the new year. Like check in Q2 and see if this is still even a topic. So anyway, look, a full show today. We knew it was going to be a full show. We didn't know we were going to get so close to an hour, but I thought that this was good. Thank you all for joining the Media Roundtable Industry Edition. This show remains dedicated to our mission of mobilizing marketers to advance truth and civility in journalism. We want you not just to know the news, but to use it for good. And if you're a marketer and you're looking to balance your business objectives with your brand values, reach out to our agency, Oxford Road, by going to oxfordroad.com. Subscribe to our weekly newsletter, The Influencer. And as always, special thanks to our guests today, Neal, Kristen, Stephen. I'm so glad you were able to come. Thank you, Shayla. Thank you, Isabella. Thank you, Jennifer, Spencer, Kyle, and the team at Podcast One. And as always, influence responsibly.